welcome to Higher Mind Yoga Podcast. This is podcast number 13. And this is Teddy here from Higher Mind Yoga. Thank you for listening. Thank you for downloading. And if you'd like to help out the podcast, you can head on over to Higher Mind Yoga, where you can help out the podcast for as little as $1. So on this podcast, I decided to bring you the Tao Te Ching. I've had the book, or versions of the book, throughout my life. Many years ago, 20 some odd or more years ago, I used to work at a bookstore, and I used to see it on the shelf. And I would pick it up occasionally and just peruse it and read it, and it'd be different translations. And then one that fell into my hands was actually a Barnes & Noble's classic translation by Charles Muller, which is a good... But there is a few translations out there. One that I ran across, which is very, very good, is by Stephen Mitchell. So I'll try to bring you a few different interpretations of different chapters here from various sources. One being Taoism.net, another one being the World I Quan Tao Headquarters, so let us begin. The Tao Te Ching, written by Lao Tzu. Chapter 1. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The unnameable is the eternally real. Naming is the origin of all particular things. Free from desire, you realize the mystery. Caught in desire, you see only the manifestations. Yet mystery and manifestations arise from the same source. This source is called darkness. Darkness within, darkness. The gateway to all understanding. Chapter 2. As soon as beauty is known by the world as beautiful, it becomes ugly. As soon as virtue is being known as something good, it becomes evil. Therefore, being and not being give birth to each other. Difficult and easy accomplish each other. Long and short form each other. High and low distinguish each other. Sound and tone harmonize each other. Before and after follow each other as a sequence. Realizing this The saint performs effortlessly according to the natural way without personal desire and practices the wordless teachings through one's deeds. The saint inspires the vitality of all lives without holding back. He nurtures all beings with no wish to take possession of. He devotes all his energy but has no intention to hold on to the merit. When success is achieved, he seeks no recognition, because he does not claim for the credit, hence shall not lose it. Chapter 3. If you do not adulate the worthy, you will make others not contentious. If you do not value rare treasures, you will stop others from stealing. If people do not see desirables, they will not be agitated. Therefore, when the sage governs, he clears people's minds, fills their bellies, weakens their ambitions, and strengthens their bones. If the people are kept without cleverness and desire, it will make the intellectuals not dare to meddle. Acting without contrivance, there is no lack of manageability. Chapter 4. The Tao is empty when utilized. It is not filled up, so deep, it seems to be the source of all thing. It blunts the sharpness, unravels the knots, dims the glare, mixes the dust. So indistinct, it seems to exist. I do not know whose offspring it is. Its image is the predecessor of the emperor. Chapter 5. The Tao doesn't take sides. It gives birth to both good and evil. The Master doesn't take sides. She welcomes both saints and sinners. The Tao is like a bellows. It is empty, yet infinitely capable. The more you use it, the more it produces. The more you talk of it, the less you understand. Hold on to the center. Chapter 6. The Tao is called the Great Mother, empty, yet inexhaustible. It gives birth to infinite worlds. It is always present within you. You can use it any way you want. Chapter 7. The Tao is infinite, eternal. Why is it eternal? It was never born. Thus, it can never die. Why is it infinite? It has no desires for itself. Thus, it is present for all beings. The Master stays behind. That is why she is ahead. She is detached from all things. That is why she is one with them. Because she has let go of herself, she is perfectly filled. Chapter 8. The highest goodness is like water. Water easily benefits all things without struggle, yet it abides in places that men hate. Therefore, it is like the Tao. For dwelling, the earth is good. For the mind, depth is good. The goodness of giving is in the timing. The goodness of speech is in the honesty. In government, self-mastery is good. In handling affairs, ability is good. If you do not wrangle, you will not be blamed. Chapter 9. Fill your bowl to the brim, and it will spill. Keep sharpening your knife, and it will blunt. Chase after money and security, and your heart will never unclench. Care about people's approval, and you will be their prisoner. Do your work, then step back, the only path to serenity. Chapter 10. Can you coax your mind from its wandering and keep to the original oneness? Can you let your body become supple as a newborn? Can you cleanse your inner vision until you see nothing but the light? Can you love people and lead them without imposing your will? Can you deal with the most vital matters by letting events take their course? Can you step back from your own mind and thus understand all things? Giving birth and nourishing, having without possessing, acting with no expectation, leading and not trying to control. This is the supreme virtue. So I've read up to chapter 10 from various versions. In my opinion, the Stephen Mitchell is probably the one that I like the most, but all the different versions have something to take away from them. I'll post links to the different versions on Higher Mind Yoga if you'd like to play along, do a little research on your own. I didn't talk too much about the origins of the Tao. I may in future episodes. But in this one, I just wanted the words to stand on their own. There's a total of what they call chapters. It's 81. So we'll possibly go through all of them eventually. And also looking into Taoist philosophy, they also have a version of yoga, Dao Yin Tu. Which I found interesting. I was trying to see since I find various threads flowing through different philosophies, just like to see if there's any other similarities. And yeah, so Dao Yin Tu, and there's actually a little drawing here I found, a painting. That's pretty interesting. I'll post that too. I don't know, I might make that the cover to the podcast. Just finding different roots of yoga here. So, and they have postures, body exercises, stretching arms and legs, leaning over, hopping, dancing, breathing exercises, using various equipment such as a stick and a ball, imitating animal behavior such as dragon, monkey, bear, and crane, and exercises targeted a specific diseases. So something else to research and find out about. I'll do some research on that. If anybody out there knows anything about the Taoist yoga, Dao Yin Tu, feel free to reach out. I noticed that the podcast is lacking in interviews. I don't know. I'm struggling with the interview portion of the podcast just because of time constraints and deciding how I want this to play out. And I hope you're still enjoying the podcast nonetheless. Like I said, this is a free form. Higher Mind Yoga is a very free form yoga podcast. Like I've been listening to other podcasts out there, and I don't know, that crackly over the phone podcast construct there is not the best, but I'll figure it out. There's a few people locally that I want to interview, and I'll get to them soon, I hope. But bear with me. I hope you're enjoying the podcast so far. So coming up next, I'm going to play a piece of audio here. This comes from a company called Wise Studies, and I'll put a link up there on Higher Mind Yoga for this. And they feature many lectures from different scholars, and they have a nice little section there on, I guess, yogic studies and Hinduism, something that's a theme here on Higher Mind Yoga. And I've enjoyed the work of James Mallinson, Jim Mallinson, PhD, and he happens to have a course up there, and there's various ways of attaining it through wisestudies.com. Pretty sure Amazon and iTunes has links there. I'll post links up there. Maybe you want to check these out. So this is a 15-minute excerpt from a 3-hour lecture that James Mallinson gives regarding the history of Hatha Yoga. And in this part, it's the prehistory of Hatha Yoga, which is very intriguing. So sit back and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to session 1 of this course, which is an introduction to Hatha Yoga. Now, what is Hatha Yoga? This is a question I ask myself often. I'm Jim Mallinson. I work at SOAS, the erstwhile School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and I'm currently leading a 5-year research project into the history and practices of Hatha Yoga. So yes, I ask myself often, what is Hatha Yoga? And the answer is not really that clear. I have to work from some kind of definition, and the place I start is in the textual definitions of Hatha Yoga. So from the Sanskrit texts which codify its practices, and they were written down. There's a sort of first wave of them from about the 11th to 15th centuries CE. And in those texts, Hatha Yoga is sometimes defined, or otherwise its characteristics are implicit, and its defining features appear to be certain practices, in particular techniques known as mudras. So in the first text that codifies the practices of Hatha Yoga and calls them that as well, is an important distinction, because there's an earlier text which I'll talk about in a later session, called the Amrita Siddhi, which is actually the first text to teach the practices of Hatha Yoga, but it doesn't mention Hatha Yoga once. And so the first text which does teach Hatha Yoga and name all its practices is a text called the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, which means something like the yoga treatise according to Dattatreya. And in that text, the defining or the distinguishing characteristics of Hatha Yoga are 9 of these practices called mudras. Now, they're all physical techniques for manipulating the body's vital energies, and I'll go into more detail about them in a later session. Right now, it's just Hatha Yoga. What does it mean? That's what I'm going to focus on. In a slightly later text, or perhaps contemporaneous with the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, but a text called the Amarauga Prabodha, which means something like the awakening of all the immortals. In that, Hatha is defined, so the Hatha variety of yoga practice is defined as that which is, the Sanskrit phrase is Prabhanjana Vidhana Rataha, so that which is intent upon or focused upon the management or control of the breath. So that's a key feature of it in these early definition, and that's then expanded in the same text. It also says that Hatha is divided into 2 kinds according to whether the focus is on the breath or bindu. Now bindu, again, I'll talk about that in more detail in a later session, but bindu is the vital principle in the yogi. And something I should make clear early on in these sessions is that the texts I'm dealing with are almost always, well, they are always written from the perspective of a male practitioner, and the prescriptions and teachings are aimed at men. We can infer from them that certain places that women were doing some of these practices and were involved in the practice of Hatha Yoga, but the texts are never geared towards its practice by women. Okay, so in the yogic physiology taught within these texts, the bindu, which is analogous to semen, is the kind of key, or one of the key vital substances which needs to be cultivated and protected by the yogi. So yes, in this Amaraga Prabodha text, Hatha Yoga is identified as yoga in which the control of the breath and bindu is paramount. And then later on in that text, it teaches various of these mudras, these techniques which are used for controlling the breath and bindu. And then in the 15th century, there's a text called the Hatha Pradipika. It's often known as the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, but I would argue that that's not really the correct name, because that's never how it's referred to in manuscript colophons. And actually, as a little aside, that raises an interesting point. I mean, I talk about Hatha Yoga, and we often talk about different methods of yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Raja Yoga, Jnana Yoga, different, whether it's the yoga of knowledge or the yoga of devotion and so forth. But in those compounds, as they're understood in Sanskrit, the usual way of understanding them is that the first member, so Hatha or Jnana for knowledge or Bhakti for devotion, is the means by which yoga is attained, because there's a sort of ambiguity in Sanskrit between whether yoga is the goal or the method. So actually, generally, when we see the compound Hatha Yoga in text, it means yoga as in the goal being achieved by the Hatha methods. So the text will often talk about just Hatha. In fact, more often than not, they'll talk about Hatha rather than Hatha Yoga, and then they'll examine the methods of Hatha. And Hatha is a very common Sanskrit word meaning force or sort of stubbornness or insistence. And I'll come back to that later on, because we need to bear that meaning in mind as well to understand the origins of where Hatha Yoga has come from, and that's what this session will be devoted to. But in the Hatha Pradipika, so that the name of that text means something like the light on Hatha, or the lamp. A Pradipika can mean a little lamp. The lamp on Hatha, so something that casts light on what Hatha is. And in that text, the defining feature of Hatha practice, well, it actually gives a sequence of the stages of Hatha practice. And the first is asana, so posture. The second is kumbhaka, breath retention. The third of these practices called mudras, which I've already mentioned, these various physical techniques for controlling the vital energies. And the fourth is nada-anusandhana, or in short, nada. And that means something like focusing on the internal sound, so the sounds that arise internally in the course of yoga practice. And so those are seen as the four stages in the practice of Hatha. Now, of those four, the first three are pretty much unique to Hatha Yoga. And in earlier treatments of yoga, so in texts predating the 11th century and so forth, we do get mentions of asana, but they are always simple or relatively simple seated postures for meditation. We also get instructions on pranayama, breath control. But again, that's always a relatively simple method of alternate nostril breathing, generally used for purification. But in the Hatha corpus, we get these more complex asanas, and we get these more complex methods of breathing in and out and holding the breath. So I think it's those the distinctive features. So the complex asanas, the complex breath control methods, and these mudras, these techniques of manipulating the vital energies. The fourth of, as mentioned in the Hatha Pradipika, the nada, listening to the internal sound, is actually found in earlier texts, in particular texts of the Tantric tradition. So we can't really see it as a distinguishing feature of Hatha Yoga, even though it's a very important method of achieving samadhi, so absorption in the self is how it's normally understood. Okay, so that's a brief overview of how Hatha is understood in the early Hatha corpus. There's a later definition which is very commonly cited in secondary sources, in books on the history of yoga and so forth, and that's from a text called the Yoga Bija, which has a verse which reads in Sanskrit, Hakarena tu suryo sao, takaren enduruchyate. Surya Chandrama Suryogad Hatha Yogo Bhidhiyate. So, and the meaning of that is by the syllable ha is meant the sun, by the syllable ta is meant the moon. And Hatha Yoga is so called because it is the union, i.e. the yoga, of the sun and the moon. Now, this appears in this text called the Yoga Bija, probably 14th, maybe 15th century. And that seems to me to be in some way trying to override the actual meaning of the word Hatha. The actual meaning of Hatha being force or sort of stubbornness. And because the way I understand, and I'll talk a bit more about this later on though, is that the texts of Hatha Yoga were written for a kind of general audience, for you and me, the regular yoga practitioner, not for the ascetics, so the kind of world renouncers, the classical sort of Indian holy men, who are always seen as the practitioners of yoga par excellence within the Indian tradition. And they are renowned, and I'll talk more about this as well shortly, for their sort of extreme ascetic practices. And that really is the first and obvious sense of the word Hatha, kind of something that's forceful, something that's difficult. But that, as the practices get translated for a less ascetic, a less renunciatory audience, that aspect of it gets slowly elided. But at the same time, one must remember that the texts that we have that tell us about the history of Hatha Yoga are really just a very small window onto the history of the tradition. And we have to use all the other sources we can, really, to try and reconstruct that history. And in particular, something I found particularly useful in my studies of these traditions is ethnographic, so anthropological research, because we do find that a lot of the culture that surrounds yoga practice continues to exist to this day. So it's very useful to spend time amongst traditional ascetic practitioners of Hatha Yoga as a means of understanding the historical context as well, because one can assume that in some respects it's still being transmitted and practiced as it always has been. So I do quite a lot of that. It's good fun as well, of course, but it's very informative. And the sort of the meaning of Hatha, the kind of the lived meaning of Hatha, as opposed to the textual meaning of Hatha, was brought home to me at a Kumbh Mela festival last year, so in 2015 in Nasik, when I was walking down to the river with a bunch of Hindu holy men, Hindu yogis, to bathe on one of the main bathing days. And we passed a sign that had been put up by the local council, the local municipal council, a big kind of poster, and it said in Hindi, well, the Hindi reads, Sadhu Ninda Mahapap hai, isliye Jatadhari Hatha Yogi Nagna Adi Sadhuon ka upahas na uraye. Now that means something like being rude to holy men is a great sin, so do not laugh at holy men who have dreadlocks, Jatadhari, who are Hatha Yogis, who are naked and so forth. Okay, so this is if Hatha Yoga is this great tradition that's taught in all these ancient hoary Sanskrit texts, as they like to say in India, at the same time, why would people laugh at Hatha Yogis? And that's because the reason why people might laugh at Hatha Yogis is because the vernacular usage of the term, so the Hindi usage of the term, generally refers to these ascetics who do these really extreme, hardcore practices, such as, holding an arm up in the air for 12 years and so forth, or never sitting down. Now, the texts of Hatha Yoga, as I mentioned, first appear from about the 11th century, AD, that is, CE, But that's just the text, okay? Now, it seems pretty clear that the practices would have been going on for much longer than that, and that's what I'm going to look into now. You know, the sort of prehistory of Hatha Yoga. So it first gets codified 11th to 14th centuries or so forth. But what evidence do we have? What are the likely forerunners of those practices, and who was doing them? This is what I want to look at.
So I hope you found that informative. And like I said, the company who is actually doing these lectures is wisestudies.com. I'll post links on Higher Mind Yoga. And once again, thank you for listening. Thank you for downloading. And if you haven't yet, set a little time to meditate or just be. Maybe you don't have to do anything. Sometimes we're saying, well, I have to do this, I have to meditate, I have to do this thing. Sometimes try to focus yourself, at least for a few moments in your waking day, to actually be and do nothing. And maybe when you're taking a nice long breath and you're inhaling, and then right at that moment when you're about to exhale, it slips right from your consciousness, but that was that moment, that little sliver in time when you were in touch with the Tao. Until next time, be well and namaste.